Tonight, we're reacting to Denver's Week 15 road victory over the Colts, their first road win of the season. We'll break down the coaching situation. We'll look ahead a little bit, also talk about the quarterbacks. You are listening to the Huddle Up Podcast.
Welcome to the Huddle Up Podcast, your go-to show for all things Broncos.
Welcome in, everybody, to the Huddle Up Podcast presented by Mile High Huddle. It's time to drop some knowledge. I'm your host, Chad Jensen, Scout Media, CBS Sports Digital. With me is Will Keys, editor and writer at Mile High Huddle. Will, were you as devastated by the end result of that Steelers-Patriots game as it seems about three-quarters of the United States were?
I don't know if devastated really sums up how I think myself and everybody else not in the New England region felt about that game. I think disgusted is probably a more appropriate term. You just kind of knew that something bad would happen, and then I think watching that replay 3 times, they're like, why are we trying to see if this is a catch or not? And he clearly caught the ball, then reached over and scored a touchdown. And then just the more times you see it, you realize that the nerds in the replay room are going to pick out something to make this good for the Patriots. And sure enough, they decided that catching the ball, tucking it into your chest, and then reaching out to cross the goal line, actually crossing the goal line, and then only when the ball hits the ground, jarring it loose a fraction of an iota of a little, I don't know. But Jesse James basically has possession for, what feels like a good 3 seconds. And it goes the Steelers' way, it goes the Patriots' way, sorry. Duron Harmon intercepts it, and, the Patriots are just going to get home field advantage and probably go to the Super Bowl again, which is a shame.
That's what's so frustrating about this game is that it, in all likelihood, is going to determine who, at the very least, has home field advantage, but in all probability, who advances to the Super Bowl from the AFC Conference. And once again, it's looking like the way is going to be open for the Patriots to go to the Super Bowl. But as we were talking a little bit off air before we started tonight, there are some glimmers of hope. The Steelers can, you never know. I mean, this is a team with Big Ben at the helm. We've seen do some pretty miraculous things in the past. And then you've got some other interesting upstarts like Jacksonville, who it'll be interesting to see if they can make some noise in the playoffs, where I have my doubts, even though they have the defense. We're talking about a team where Blake Bortles is their starting quarterback. As important as it is to have that defense, defense wins championships and all that good stuff. It's all about the quarterback in the postseason. In the playoffs, man, you just got to have that rare combo of a team hitting their peak defensively with a competent upper echelon quarterback. And I just don't think the Jags are going to have what it takes this time around, but they're going to be a force to be reckoned with for the near future.
I would agree. I mean, Blake Bortles, I think he's thrown something like 11 touchdowns. Hopefully that stat's right, over the last 3 weeks, which is kind of absurd. But he's got 19 touchdowns, 8 interceptions this year, and for all the flack that he's gotten, he's actually turned things around pretty well. And
he looked.
We got to give him credit.
2 years ago, he looked like a guy who was deserving of whatever he was, a third overall pick. I mean, he was throwing he went over 4,000 yards passing. Allen Robinson, Allen Hurns, those guys were putting up some prolific numbers. And then last year, he just took 2-3 major steps backward in his development. Who knows? Right now it doesn't seem as if he's going to be Jacksonville's long-term answer. But, if they go to this will be the first time in whatever it's been, like 10 years, that Jacksonville will be in the playoffs. And they might not want to fiddle too much with that formula. Who knows?
I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't. Give him a little more time to grow. See what happens.
Well, we're here to talk some Broncos. We're here, the Huddle Up Podcast, to give you a deep dive on your favorite team, and we need your help. Make sure you take some time, if you haven't done this already, and go to iTunes, or if you're using Stitcher or whatever service you're listening to this show on, and leave a creative review. Make sure you rate the show. Big help to us. We'd appreciate it. Also, just to drop the social media follows, Huddle Up Pod on Twitter, at Huddle Up Pod. And, of course, at Mile High Huddle. Also, we're on Facebook, Mile High Huddle on Facebook. Make sure you give us a like there. And you got to be subscribing because we've only got, 2 more games left. And then it's going to be the tumultuous, probably the most tumultuous offseason we've seen in Denver in a long, long time, and you're not going to want to miss a single episode. We do have a lot to get to today, but first we want to say thank you to our sponsor, Rep the Squad. Now, Rep the Squad is a jersey subscription club that lets you rep every jersey you want. With hundreds of different jerseys, Rep the Squad allows you to switch between your favorite stars and styles whenever you like. Adult memberships are just $19.95 per month. Youth are $16.95 per month. New jerseys arrive fresh and clean within about 2 to 3 days of you ordering. It's kind of like Netflix for jerseys. What it does, Rep the Squad, is you get to rep the Broncos, rep the Orange Crush all season long, no matter if it's home, away, or alternate, and you're not having to spend $100+ each time you order a jersey. You get to switch them out whenever you want. You get sick of this player, you go on to the next. Free shipping both ways. Cancel anytime. Phenomenal service, phenomenal product for every Broncos fan out there. But here's the key. Use promotion code HUDDLE, that's HUDDLE, to get 50% off your first month at repthesquad.com. That's promo code HUDDLE at repthesquad.com. All right, so we're a little bit late to this story because we had some events conspire against us that we couldn't podcast immediately following Denver's victory on Thursday night over the Colts. So here we are. We're going to touch on a few storylines that came out of that game and talk about the fact that the Broncos, again, this is their first win on the road this season, which is just crazy.
Unbelievable.
But on top of that, the last time the Broncos won in Indianapolis, Jake Plummer was sporting that number 16 jersey and getting it done, if I recall right, against Jim Sorgi. They had sat Peyton Manning because they had already clinched playoffs, number 1 or number 2 seed. So Jake Plummer got to go and beat up on Jim Sorgi and company, only to, I think it was 1 or 2 weeks later, get decimated in the same building when Peyton Manning came back. So it's been that long, boys and girls. And it started out not so hot with Trevor Siemian throwing an interception. Not too long after that, he gets knocked from the game. And, Will, Treasure, your boy, he's done for the season, or what's left of it. How do you feel about that?
You know what? He's had trouble. I think durability is kind of one of his biggest weaknesses. I love the guy. I think everybody knows that. But I think the Broncos will be better off with Brock Osweiler for the rest of this season. I don't think he's going to play quite as well as he did on Thursday. And I think it might be impossible to play better than he did.
We should
actually
talk about that.
Yeah, there's a pretty mind-blowing stat that we'll unleash on you guys pretty soon. But it is too bad for Siemian. And to think about, how much things have changed just from week 2 or 3 or even week 4 when they were 3-1 and he looked like he was,
solid.
He was the heir apparent, at some point.
Well, after week 2, even on this podcast, I said if he keeps this up, this is a guy that you got to extend. You got to offer him that contract. It was such – they blew out a team that was supposed to come in and blow them out. And they did it in such spectacular fashion. And Trevor Siemian was one of the key factors. It's just crazy how this season has inverted since then.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I don't know if it's not obviously entirely one player, and we've kind of stressed that for a long time, but he didn't keep things up, and neither did the rest of the team, really. It was the eight game losing streak wasn't on one player in particular. Obviously, all 3 quarterbacks had a hand. They all contributed to the losing streak, and so did the rest of the team, because it's not a quarterback driven operation really in Denver. As much as we like to talk about the quarterbacks, it's all 53 guys, and the strength has been the defense, and that was kind of the problem. But Trevor Siemian, the future is kind of a mystery, because we were talking about him being kind of the ideal backup, and you see what Brock Osweiler does off the bench. It looks like he might be the ideal backup, but who knows?
Yeah, he comes in, Brock Osweiler, and arguably plays his best game as a pro. Now, we have to balance this with the fact, we got to point this out. It was against the lowly Indianapolis Colts. And it was on the road in a hostile environment with a stadium about 1/3 of the way full of Colts fans. But here's the stat that Will was alluding to just a moment ago. This is from ESPN Stats and Info after the game. Quote, Brock Osweiler's 99.2 total QBR tonight is the highest in the NFL for any QB in a game this season. That's with a minimum of 20 action plays in parentheses. It's the highest total QBR in a game for a non-starting quarterback in the 12 seasons for which ESPN has total QBR data, close quote. So, I mean, he was good. I didn't realize he was that good, but obviously he was a clear difference maker in that game and played the cleanest, most polished, most explosive, most effective play from Brock Osweiler that we've seen, I think, since he came to Denver, and that goes all the way back to 2012 and what he was doing as a starter in 2015. And it's just really interesting. And the biggest thing and that's really bothered me about Trevor Siemian as a starting quarterback is, last year when things were going good for the Broncos, it was looking like it was actually a positive. His cool, calm demeanor, his unflappability, poise in the storm, etc. But when sometimes your team from your quarterback position needs that guy like a Kirk Cousins storming down the tunnel saying, you like that. You need a quarterback that's chasing down his receiver after a big play or a touchdown to celebrate. And, sometimes you see him jawing in the other guy's face or whatever it might be. You need some of that emotional spark and some leadership in that aspect, some real enthusiasm that at times, I'm not saying always. I mean, look at Peyton Manning. Peyton Manning wasn't a guy always rushing down the field after a big touchdown to, bump helmets with his wideouts. But you saw him be very animated, very passionate, lead in a very extroverted way at times when the situation called for it.
Yeah, DJ Swearinger in that Texans preseason game.
When he knocked out Wes
example.
Welker and gave him a freaking concussion. And that's the thing with Brock is that's the best thing, in my opinion, about Brock is that energy he brings. Now, if only his actual skill set could match what he does and can do as a leader, the Broncos would have a franchise quarterback. But alas, the two don't quite meet up when the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, I think one thing that worked in favor of Brock Osweiler was I think this is obviously the best quarterbacked game that we've seen in the Skycam era of Thursday Night Football. And so I think, but really, like when you see passes like the one he made, especially the touchdown, the 54-yard touchdown with Jeff Hireman, that from the reverse angle, or not the reverse angle, but from the Skycam angle, I guess, that throw looked borderline impossible. And the way he kind of just threaded it in there down the seam to a guy who's not known for his explosive plays in Jeff Hireman, I think that really helped shape the perception about a guy. And I like, it sounds ridiculous to say that a camera angle can do that,
right?
But when you see the arm from just a different perspective, like what a great hose he has. Like you don't see it necessarily in the broadcast view because
get your minds out of the gutter, people.
Yeah, seriously, what a great arm he has. Just to clarify. But yeah, it doesn't necessarily come across quite as much as it does on the broadcast view, and then you can obviously see it too if you watch a game in person. I've seen Brock play in person too, and you can kind of tell what kind of arm he has. But that Skycam angle just gives you a different look at it, and he really made the most of it. And I think he's, if not saved his career in Denver, then he's extended his football career in the NFL by a few years. And it's the Fitzpatrick effect, like I talked about the other week.
Yeah. Well, save some of that down the road stuff for later in the show. We have a couple of topics. We'll dive in a little bit deeper into Brock's possible future and where he goes from here. But let's move on and talk about some of the other aspects of this win for the Broncos. Now, as an offense, of course, they put up 25 points, 462 total yards, which was impressive, especially, again, considering that they were on the road. Defensively, they hold up. 228 total yards are allowed to Jacoby Brissett and company. They were unable, the Broncos, to take the ball away, but they still pretty much stymied that team for the better part of the game. And then flipping it back to the offensive side, Cody Latimer, I mean, that game, he's been playing, this whole season when he's been available, between his special teams and then his small amount of impact he's been able to make on offense, I think even before this game, earned him another contract with the Broncos. Not a blockbuster deal, don't get me wrong, but some kind of a team-friendly deal coming, or at least an offer from the Broncos to come back. Whereas before this season started, it felt like a foregone conclusion that he was just one of those second-round busts that, when 2017 wrapped up was going to be, in the rear view, so to speak, and just allowed to walk. This game, I think, put an exclamation point on his body of work late in his career in this first contract with the Broncos. 3 receptions, 60 yards, his second touchdown of the season, and then, of course, to cap that off, he hauls in the 2-point conversion on the same touchdown that he grabbed. Cody Latimer, I mean, this is a guy, Will, that I think the Broncos, he just brings so much. He's finally, I mean, let's face it, when the Broncos drafted him in 2014, it was not long after they had just signed Emmanuel Sanders to a 3-year deal. Demaryius Thomas was coming up on, his contract was running out, but they knew they were going to keep Demaryius in town long term. He was the clear-cut number one receiver. They let Eric Decker go. They knew they were going to let Julius Thomas go. So Demaryius was the established number one going forward. Sanders is brought in as a mercenary to fill in, while Cody Latimer can be groomed to step in and be the number two eventually when Sanders' deal expired. Unfortunately, it's not the way it shook out, but the way he's playing this year, Will, throw aside his special teams acumen, the way he's played as a wideout in this offense this year, we're finally starting to see some of that ceiling that the Broncos saw to take him in the second round.
Yeah, no, he's an incredibly athletic receiver, and I think just the story of Cody Latimer's football career through his first 4 years is really something to be admired and something that a lot of people should kind of take inspiration in, just because, you know, he's drafted out of Indiana in the second round, not a very highly touted wide receiver, especially, you know, from one of the least talked about Big Ten schools, especially in football, but he ends up being a day 2 pick. Comes to Denver and doesn't quite hit it off, I guess, with Peyton Manning. Looks pretty good in the preseason, especially with Brock Osweiler at quarterback. I think he catches a long touchdown against San Francisco that kind of made people turn their heads a little bit.
And he knocked out Antoine Bethea. That's
right.
Anyway.
Yeah, so he doesn't really, you know, catch up and learn the playbook. Doesn't even get in the end zone until his second year, 2015, and that's when Brock Osweiler is given the job. And he never really quite catches on, but what he does is he makes the most out of all of his abilities, and that's through special teams. He's a great run blocker, actually, which I think Chris Collinsworth pointed out in that Thursday night game. But, you know, he could never quite figure it out as a receiver, and he is now a little bit to some extent, and maybe not something that's worth the second-round price tag that the Broncos spent on him 4 years ago, but he made the best of a bad situation is what I'm trying to say. Yep. And a lot of wide receivers, I think, wide receivers more than any other position, because, you know, it's kind of known as that diva position, not to stereotype an entire group of people here, but
yeah,
they're not known for willingness, I guess, in other areas, most of them at least.
Well, he steps into a room now we didn't know it at the time, but he steps into a wide receiver room as a rookie with 3 Pro Bowl caliber players. Demaryius Thomas had already been to a Pro Bowl, Wes Welker Pro Bowl. Emmanuel Sanders hadn't quite up to that point, but the Broncos had just paid him, and so he was going to be the number 2 receiver. And so obviously it was going to take some time for him to crack the offense, and I'm just glad to see it finally happening. And it's just enough that he's not going to be able to go out on the open market and just rake it in. The Broncos are going to be able to probably re-sign him without too much competition and without having to break the bank. And to your point about the blocking as a run blocker, I did a VIP film piece for the Mile High Huddle VIPs on the day after the game. And going through and watching each play twice from the coach's film, all 22, I mean, I think I highlighted just one running play. But there were multiple plays of him just giving that extra effort, oftentimes on blocks that weren't on play side, you know, but he's up there just totally in a guy's grill, opening the way and doing what he's got to do. So he's a multi-tool guy. Happy for him, happy that he's finally seeing some success, and let's hope the Broncos bring him back. Now, one last thing from that game I want to touch on about the players themselves was C.J. Anderson. This guy is now within striking distance of that elusive 1,000-yard season, which he has never had. Now, you go back to 2014, he had over 1,000 yards from scrimmage in the final 8 games in which he appeared with the Broncos, but not as a rusher, right? I think his 800-something total yard, or 800-something rushing yards, his breakout year in 2014. He's got a chance, Will, a real opportunity to crack that 1,000 yards. And on Monday, Vance Joseph was asked about it. The Broncos as a team are well aware of how close C.J. Anderson is to hitting that mark and are going to be working their tails off to try and help him hit it. On the night in Indy, 30 carries, 158 yards. Here's your pop quiz, Will. and for you listeners out there.
Sure.
Who was the last player to rush for 1,000 yards for the Denver Broncos and when?
That would be Sean Moreno in 2013.
Boom. So it's been a minute. It's been a while since the Broncos have had a 1,000-yard rusher. So that'd be good for CJ, because there's a chance the Broncos will keep him around a sliver at his current $4.5 million price tag. In all likelihood, what they'll probably do is ask him to take a pay cut, and he'll probably turn him down. And if he has that 1,000 yards, he should be able to go out there and get himself a nice contract.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of had the most unassuming monster rushing game of all time, I think, on Thursday night, because you just look up and he never really broke a big run, or maybe this is the Skycam at work again, because the runs don't look quite as long on Skycam as they do in broadcast view, but he kept just banging out like 7 yards, 8 yards, 10 yards, the occasional like 14 or 16-yard run. But he never like busted loose for any like explosive 20-plus yard plays. So you just like turn your, you look up and he's like, and CJ Anderson's at 25 carries, 130 yards, and it never really felt like it, but that's kind of a good thing to have in an offense where you're just steadily moving forward. And it's better to get 158 yards on a ton of carries than one massive run, like kind of the Ronnie Hillman path to 100 yards. But
right,
it's good. It's good just to keep an offense on track and help out the quarterback and get you in good downs and distances. And I think that definitely showed up. It really helped the offense.
After the game, Vance Joseph talked about the Broncos finally figuring out how to play to their formula. What is that? Run the ball with authority, protect the ball, play good defense, establish a lead so the defense can play to their strengths, put some points on the board, take your shots downfield when you've got the defense on their heels and in a situation where they can be exploited. And that's exactly what Brock Osweiler, Bill Musgrave and company were able to accomplish as a unit. You keep hearing about, and Vance Joseph, to his credit, has talked about this, playing as a team. These last 2 weeks, the Broncos have played as a team, whether it was Trevor Siemian at quarterback or Brock Osweiler. My question, Will, is Vance Joseph talking about the Broncos playing to their formula finally, with a tone of exasperation in his voice. He's appreciative of what's happening, but he's like, what took so long? Why did this take so long? What was it that held the Broncos back from, we're not talking about a advanced style of play here. We're not talking about the 2013 Broncos offense that's Star Wars numbers, to quote Jim Irsay. We're talking about a team very limited from the quarterback position. Every coach, I would assume, on that staff knew quarterback was limiting this year. So they're going to have to batten down the hatches, play a reserved kind of, ground control, run out the clock type. Basically what we've seen the last 2 weeks, take your shots when you can get them, and try and make this thing work. What in the heck? There's the question that Vance Joseph was going to have to answer to John Elway at the end of the season, which is, why did it take so long? What's your take on that?
Well, I can give you kind of two reasons that they're finally playing to their formula. And the first is that they're playing the Jets and the Colts, which I think is good for any struggling team. It's good
Indeed.
for what ails you
Indeed.
to play Bryce Petty and Jacoby Brissett in back-to-back weeks. But the second reason is they've only turned the ball over once in the last 2 weeks, and the one turnover that they have in those last 2 weeks have led to points. And another thing, and I think we'll talk about this later with the offensive coordinator, but they're not panicking. They didn't panic when they went down against the Colts. They kind of stuck to their guns and ran CJ Anderson, and they had a 3-and-out to start with Brock, but they just kept going, and they overcame penalties, like with Garrett Bowles holding on that really spectacular catch and run by Devontae Booker, and didn't let it slow him down. And I think in weeks past, that would have been kind of it for that drive.
That would have crushed him.
This time they found a way. I don't know what it was. Maybe it's just Brock Osweiler's got a good attitude or something worked. Again, they're playing the Colts. Right, yeah, he's got that hose. But it's good to be able to overcome mistakes and come back and put the ball in the end zone, and that's what they did. And finally, it's working out. And who knows how long it'll last? But it's nice while it's happening.
I wrote about that. In fact, today talking about our next topic here, which is Bill Musgrave, that on that drive in which Devontae Booker made his Herculean leap over the Colts defender for a touchdown that was wiped off the board by a Garrett Bowles holding penalty, that the Broncos of the first 3 quarters of this season, that would have totally caused them to crumble. That would have been either a field goal attempt, which probably would have been missed by Brandon
Yeah, really.
Or, a punt, or maybe even a turnover. I mean, when it rains, it pours type things for the Broncos this year. But a switch has been flipped in that sense. We'll try and put our finger on what exactly changed or what exactly that switch is and how it was flipped. I think a lot of it has to do with the change at offensive coordinator. Now, listen, I'm not going to sit here and bag on Mike McCoy. Okay, Mike McCoy is, when this past offseason, after he got jettisoned from the Chargers as head coach, he was one of the hottest names on the coaching market for offensive coordinator in the NFL, and for a reason. He's a very talented, very smart offensive mind, and going into this season, I think the biggest mistake he made, and I'm going to tie this into Bill Musgrave, the biggest mistake Mike McCoy made, we've heard reports about how his playbook was actually bigger than the playbook the Broncos were operating under McCoy with Peyton Manning. And he went into this season with a playbook that sophisticated, that big, that deep, with 2 quarterbacks. Okay, this was before. I mean, that playbook, if any of you have not read Take Your Eye Off the Ball by Pat Kirwan, you got to take some time, get on Amazon, order that bad boy. You'll learn, one of the many, many things you'll learn is that playbooks, it's like what the Broncos did in 2011 where they switched from Orton to Tebow and the offense changed on a dime. That is so rare and almost impossible for NFL teams to do, because by the time teams get to training camp, the playbook is in the books. That's it. That's the way it's going to be. And you can play off different things. You can change it. You can tweak it here and there. But fundamentally, the playbook is what it's going to be by the time you hit training camp. And if we go back in time, the Broncos had 3 quarterbacks, not counting Chad Kelly. Let's just focus on Trevor Siemian here and Paxton Lynch. Why would McCoy think he could make a system like that pass happy? I mean, how many times was Trevor Siemian thrown 40 times or more during Mike McCoy's tenure? It just didn't make sense. There was some kind of a disconnect there, which is so ironic, Will, because he is known, Mike McCoy, as the coach who is going to fit the system to the talent that he has. And yet, for whatever reason, he could not recognize that he didn't have the caliber of quarterback talent in his unit to play and utilize and make the most out of that playbook. So I think that's the biggest thing. Bill Musgrave comes in, and he pares this thing down. It's like he basically heard it from Vance Joseph. We need to pare this thing down. We need to focus on the run. We need to be more careful with the ball, limit the opportunities for our quarterbacks to make mistakes, and just go out there and play physical football. And that's exactly what the Broncos have done. Over the last 4 games in which Bill Musgrave has been the coordinator, the Broncos have rushed for 456 yards. They're scoring points despite 3 different quarterbacks that Bill Musgrave has actually had to start, or I shouldn't say start, but play with over these 4 games. The play calling, the scheme has vastly improved, and that's I think the biggest thing for me, Will, with Bill Musgrave is that not only is he scheming to the strengths of his personnel, the irony is that Mike McCoy should have been doing that, but not only is he doing that, but as a play caller, as a tactician in the moment, he has just been in his zone, at least the last couple weeks. Like, he is just finding the right play calls at the right moments to capitalize on the right looks and just totally deflate these opposing defenses. I can't tell you enough how impressed I've been with Bill Musgrave, and I'm just really hopeful. We'll talk more about this here in a little bit, but I'm just hopeful that he's a guy that ends up sticking around in Denver.
Yeah, I do too. And he was kind of, I think Mike McCoy got into trouble where when your quarterback's playing well, and he definitely was in the first 2 weeks, that kind of erases everything else that goes wrong on the offensive side, like, the offensive line troubles, which they were having in the first couple of weeks. It's just that Trevor Siemian was kind of playing above them. And the thing is, when they got into a hole in Buffalo, they just didn't know how to get out of it. And they were kind of doing this thing where it's kind of the reverse Kubiak philosophy on offense, where Kubiak would kind of like to, start off like the first 3 plays on offense with a pass. And it's kind of the Shanahan-Kubiak school of thinking too, where you're just really aggressive on the first drive, try to get that lead, and then run the football. And it seemed like McCoy was getting into trouble where he was trying to do the opposite. And they're running the football and then getting into a deficit. Maybe they turn the ball over once or twice, and then it's just pass from there.
That's a good observation, man. I hadn't thought about that.
And it's just not an effective way to play because they were aggressive, I think, especially in that Dallas game. They come out and throw the ball down the field. They run the ball too well, where Musgrave, he's got a balance about him, I think. Mm-hmm. And that Jets game was the perfect example because, it's easy to run the ball a lot when it's working, which obviously they run the ball 30 times with C.J. Anderson and then a few more times with Booker on Thursday night. But that's not really as admirable to run the football when you're getting huge chunk plays just about every time. But what I liked about that Jets game was they weren't really getting a ton of ground or a ton of room on the ground against New York just because they've got a really good defensive front. Mm-hmm. But they didn't really care. They just kept plugging away and running, and it's just a good thing for the quarterback because it sets up play action.
Wears out the
defense. Yeah, it wears out the defense, and it just keeps them on their toes a little bit. Where McCoy just kind of got him in situations where the pass is coming.
Yep. And
to have that predictability is a death sentence for an offense. And Bill Musgrave, I think, has figured that out, and you can really tell. It hasn't been, tremendously explosive, obviously, 24 and 25 points in the last 2 games, but it's been perfect for the formula, especially with the defense coming together like it has.
We do have a few more topics to digest before we get out of here, but before we do, we want to say thank you to our sponsor, Audible. Get a free audiobook download, you guys, and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/huddleup. Over 180,000 different titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Again, that's audibletrial.com/huddleup. For example, Take Your Eye Off the Ball by Pat Kirwan. That's something that you could be listening to right after this podcast. Get a free audiobook. Get your download. There's that great, I forget the title now off the top of my head, but the Steve Belichick scouting book, phenomenal. Fans of this podcast would really enjoy those type of things. And to listen to them in the audiobook format, Carl Dumler, our colleague here on the show, talked about listening through Audible to that Steve Belichick book. And that's something you could do. If you're not sure about it, you're not a big reader, that's fine. But Audible allows you to consume the books that you want to read without having to sit down and turn the pages, and you can do it while you're doing other things, whether it's driving, your commute, running, the gym, cooking, yard work, whatever it might be. So take some time and go to audibletrial.com/huddleup. You get that free book. You get a 30-day trial to check it out. And I promise you, if you give it a whirl, you're going to like it, and you're going to come back and you're going to thank us. And those of you who have taken the opportunity to patronize our sponsors, supporting the show, big shout out and a big thank you from all of us here at the Huddle Up Podcast. Now, let's talk about the quarterback situation, at least this week. Is it going to be Paxton Lynch? Is it going to be Osweiler? Trevor Siemian, of course, going on injured reserve. And it really is a little bit of a Sophie's choice, and I say that in all seriousness for the Denver Broncos because you have Brock Osweiler coming off his, again, arguably his best performance as a pro, and you want more of that. It's like Vance Joseph has talked about. Whoever we have at quarterback, we're not going to forfeit games. The goal is still to win. But at the same time, you have a now healthy, unquestionably healthy Paxton Lynch, whom the Broncos going into this offseason need as much information as possible as they can get on this guy. And so it really has left the Broncos in a little bit of a conundrum. And here's what, when asked specifically on Monday, what they're going to do at quarterback this week. Here's what Coach Joseph said, just really quick.
I'm not sure. We're going to obviously discuss it with the staff and see where we are, with both guys. Obviously, Paxton hadn't practiced in 3 weeks. We've got to see where he's at physically. He came in Saturday and Sunday, threw the ball, rehab. So we'll see. But it's a lot of things that goes into that decision, who plays this week for us.
So they're going to sit down with the staff. I would assume that probably includes John Elway and talk about who is going to be the quarterback this week on the road yet again against the Washington Redskins. Will, if you were running this organization, who would you start this week?
I mean, I think it's impossible not to start Brock Osweiler the way he played, given the way he played last week. I mean, I don't see any scenario where a guy comes off the bench, and then puts up the best quarterback performance of the season, and you say, well, we actually have to see what this other guy's got. And it's just, in a perfect world, you would want to see what Paxton Lynch brings to the table a little bit more than you already have.
Right.
Because I don't know. I don't know how much better it gets than that Raiders game, really. I think, that kind of confirmed everybody's suspicions, especially since, that Jaguars game last year. But I don't know how you justify that.
Yeah.
Because it tells the locker room, performance isn't the number one thing.
Right.
At this stage of the season, it's about evaluation. It really should be about performance number one, and I think it sends the wrong message to not play your best player, and that's clearly Brock Osweiler right now.
I feel the same way today as I did coming out of that Oakland game in which Lynch was knocked out of the game, crying on the sideline. I really feel like the Broncos, they're going to be tempted, but I really do feel like they've seen about everything they need to see from Paxton Lynch. And listen, it's not just all about what he's done on the field. In most cases, that would be the greatest portion of your measuring stick, how they actually perform on game day. Well, he's only got 3 starts, and when you add them all together, including the Tampa Bay game last year, he's basically got 3 full games of NFL experience, right? And unfortunately, with Paxton Lynch, part of this issue is that what is really holding him back, and one of the reasons why the Broncos probably feel like they don't need to see much more from Paxton Lynch, is all the other stuff that he does or doesn't do off the field, whether it's a lack of maturity, unwillingness to put in the work, put in the effort, lack of preparation. I mean, there's so many moving parts to the full story that is Paxton Lynch that by this point, almost 2 full years since he was drafted in the first round, he really has devolved to a point where the Broncos don't really need to see anything more from him. Like, they feel like they have a pretty good beat on what the book is on Paxton Lynch. And as sad and as frustrating as that is, seeing that the Broncos traded up, gave up a 3rd-round pick to move up in the first round and take this guy, he's a first-round bust. And you can talk about reasons why you would want to keep him on. He's still got 2 more years left in his contract. He was a 2 or 3 year project to begin with. Why would you give up on him now? The Broncos are at a crossroads going into 2018 when it comes to the quarterback position. They need to have guys who they can count on as being part of the solution, whether it's as a starter, and if not, cross that off the list, catch you later, or a backup. Let me ask you this. Going into next season, and this is to the listeners, let's say it's Kirk Cousins. Let's say it's another first-round, high-round quarterback, whoever it might be, okay? The Broncos have a new established starter at quarterback. If that person goes down, would you want Paxton Lynch to be your last line of defense at quarterback? I mean, ask yourself that question, because I think at this point, you wouldn't want to risk that if you're the Denver Broncos after everything they've been through, not only with Lynch, but everything they've been through this year. They need stability. They need someone they can count on. And you know what? Going into next year, Brock Osweiler might not have done enough to be able to prove to the Broncos that he can be their starter, but he has at the very least proven to them that he'd be worth a few $1 million a year to keep around as a backup quarterback. I don't see, honestly, I really don't see any reason for the Broncos to go back to Lynch, even though this season is over. There's nothing to play for in terms of, postseason positioning and seeding and winning a division and all that stuff. There's just absolutely no reason for the Broncos. And I agree with you on that point, that is it about evaluation or is it about guys who execute? Brock Osweiler executed. You found a way to turn the ship around late in the year. Why would you, going back to Vance Joseph talking about his formula, why would you want to fiddle with that in the eyes of the veterans?
And I think, 30 games in to someone's career, if you're still saying we have to see what this guy's got, I think that answers your question that he probably doesn't have it. And I don't know, it's too bad. But if you're a first-round quarterback and you can't, make it clear that you should be on the field 30 games in at the end of the second season, I mean, that's all the evidence you need, really, I think.
Agreed. let's move on and talk a little bit about. Well, actually, let's play a game, a little segment. We'll call it "Who Survives." We've received quite a few questions. I have anyway, from fans, from readers, from listeners. Wanted to know what in the heck's going to happen with this coaching staff coming out of this season. So we'll play a little game called Who Survives, and I'll just serve them up to you, Will, and I'll offer my thoughts on each one. Who survives out of Vance Joseph? Is he surviving this season in your mind?
Oh, okay. So you're talking about the offseason. I thought you were referring to some type of 5-man battle royale in which they all fought to the death. In which case, I'm not sure if I would take Davidson or Olivo, but it's definitely one of the two.
I would take Kolar, Bill Kolar, if it was in that situation.
Yeah.
But
I don't think he's going anywhere.
Vance Joseph, has he done enough in your mind, or do you think he's done enough in the minds of the Broncos?
I don't know, because it seemed like there were conflicting reports a couple days ago, that said, now the Broncos want to keep him, and that kind of runs contrary to everything that we're hearing over the 8-game losing streak. But I think it comes down to if he can win out and win the last 4 games, I think he's, given the Broncos a reason to keep him around.
I would agree with you, and I would even say that if they win one of their last 2 games, and so long as they're competitive in that 4th one, even if they lose,
yeah.
I think Joseph, because think about this, how easy would it have been for a first-year head coach embattled in an 8-game losing streak to just,
fold,
just surrender to the fates, But he didn't. He found a way to make whatever changes, tweaks, had to fire one of his most valued coordinators, a guy who he actually talked about wanting to get in his interview for the job with the Broncos. Mike McCoy was a big part of Vance Joseph coming to Denver. He had to fire that guy. He did what it took, and I think ultimately the wherewithal to put a stranglehold on this situation and turn the ship around, even though it was too late by this point. I mean, the season was over. It does show a toughness. It does show a certain mettle that is very intriguing. And if you can put the right pieces personnel-wise in place, I mean, that's the one aspect that was believable to me, especially in that Ian Rappaport report right before the Jets game, in which he said the Broncos are looking for a reason to keep him. They don't want to fire Vance Joseph. The caveat to that report was that they knew they handed Vance Joseph it wasn't an ideal quarterback situation. Let's just put it that way. So For me, I look at what he was able to do over the last couple of games. Granted, against subpar, I mean, we're not talking about the best teams in the league. These next 2 games will be a little bit more defining in that regard as far as the level of competition. But if you can put a quarterback who has some skill, who has some ability in the Broncos locker room, in that offense, put a few more pieces in place, like, find another good tackle on the offensive line. I don't care what you do with Bowles, whether it's left or right, but find one more tackle that you can count on. You've found your guard of the future in Connor McGovern. Max Garcia, after this season, you're a swing guard in Denver, no more. Ron Leary, you've already got him. Matt Paradis, he's a restricted free agent. So you've got your offensive line, with the exception of one position, relatively sewn up, and with some confidence, I might add. I mean, Connor McGovern has played extremely well over the last 3 weeks. So you make a few tweaks, add a few pieces of personnel here and there, so long as you get the right guy at quarterback. Vance Joseph might be the guy to turn this thing around long term. So I agree. I think Vance Joseph is coming back. There's little doubt in my mind, unless the Broncos go into these 2 games and completely crap the bed and are not competitive whatsoever and get blown out. Now, here's another one. Now, that some of these might be, you might think, dependent on whether or not Vance Joseph comes back, and that might be true. But I also want you to consider the fact that last year, just less than a year coming off a Super Bowl win, the Broncos wanted to keep Gary Kubiak, but they wanted to fire everyone except Wade Phillips, who they were just going to let go. Basically, all of Kubiak's offensive staff, they were going to show the door. So what I'm trying to explain to you is it is within the realm of possibility that a front office and an ownership can say, we want to keep the head coach but make changes at certain quarterbacks or coordinator in whatever position. So here's my next question for you. Does Bill Musgrave survive? Does he get kept around in more than an interim position as offensive coordinator?
I mean, again, you'd have to say that it comes down to the next 2 games, but given what we've seen from him already in the last 2 games, I think, he's found himself a spot permanently. I use permanent in quotation marks just because it's the NFL and there's nothing permanent about it. But I think, given the way that he's called the last two games and the things I talked about, like balance and being committed to the run and being less predictable than they were under Mike McCoy, I think so. And he's got the track record to prove it. You saw what happened, too, to the Oakland Raiders offense with and without Bill Musgrave. And I don't know that he's ever going to turn the Broncos offense into what we saw last year with the Raiders, but, I think all signs point to him sticking around.
You get the quarterback, and he very well could. All right, I wrote about this today. We're tracking this Monday, of course. Bill Musgrave in 2016 fielded the number 6 total offense for the Oakland Raiders. This year, they jettisoned him, of course. They put in Todd Downing as offensive coordinator, and they dropped to 6-8 in the standings with 2 games left to go, and now they're the 19th overall offense. So Bill Musgrave, you put the right piece in place quarterback-wise. And, so many coordinators are dependent, of course, on the quarterback. But you just go out and you get him a competent quarterback with some talent, and I think he's going to be able to do some really good things. My question, and then we'll move on, my question is he going to want to stick around even if they offer him the full-time coordinator position? That's a question for another time. But how about Joe Woods after such an up-and-down season? He's John Elway's darling. He's a guy that he was willing to get rid of Wade Phillips in order to push forth Joe Woods and promote him up the tree. Does he survive?
I think without the last couple of games, you would be really skeptical to keep him around, but the defense has responded so well. And it was such a hard position to be in as a defense and a defensive coordinator with the offense and special teams playing as poorly as they did for most of the season, that I think you kind of just give Joe Woods a mulligan for a few of those games. And, now that we've seen what the defense is at their best, like shutting out the Jets 24-0, and then really putting away the Colts in the second half.
Yep.
I think you do keep Joe Woods around and hope that a little more balance and fewer turnovers that put the defense in bad spots mean a return to dominance for the Broncos defense. So, I think you would have to keep him around.
I would agree. I would agree that the last 2 weeks have really helped kind of bolster Woods' standing within the Broncos organization. The biggest thing for Joe Woods' unit, I mean, as you say, he was handed a pretty raw deal with all the turnovers this year and all the sudden changes. But for whatever reason, his team, his unit, did not respond well to those situations. Touchdown after touchdown after touchdown after touchdown surrendered in those situations that, it's disheartening. The team as a unit, as a complete team, was very low. So it's understandable in a sense how things were allowed to get so out of hand, even on such a talented defense. But I do agree that Joe Woods, you go out, you stop Kirk Cousins, you go out and you put an exclamation point on this season by beating the Chiefs. I think Joe Woods sticks around. Here's a more interesting one maybe. Brock Olivo. We're talking about a special teams unit. Let me just preface this. Who's given up, I believe if I recall right, multiple returns on kick and punt coverage. Brandon McManus has completely regressed to a point where you can't count on him after going into this season as the most accurate kicker in Broncos history. And then you're continuously fielding a returner who's got fumbleitis, a very virulent case of fumbleitis, over and over again. So does Brock Olivo survive this season?
This is the one who it pains me to say it because I love everything that Brock Olivo stands for and just the kind of person that he is, but I don't think he makes it just because it's been consistently bad on special teams. And when I say consistently, I mean like from the first game of the preseason on. And we were talking about it in the preseason too, where I was putting Brock Olivo on my my naughty list, basically, to use a Christmas analogy. But we were kind of hoping that, because in the preseason, the special teams unit is basically comprised of guys that aren't going to be on the team come regular season. And we've given it 14 weeks, and I think it either stayed as bad as it was in the preseason or potentially got worse. So I don't know. There's some things I wouldn't attribute to him, kind of like Brandon McManus missing a few field goals. I don't know how much that's on a special teams coordinator. But there are things like getting a delay of game penalty when they didn't know who was on the field goal unit last week against the Colts, which backed the field goal up 5 yards, which caused I don't know if it caused McManus to miss it, but he missed it by a margin of less than 5 yards. Yeah. So those are things that you can't have, and so I think that falls on the coordinator. So as much as I do love Brock Olivo and the crazy genius that he appears to be in press conferences, we might have to show him the door.
I think unless Vance Joseph is so confident in his place with the Broncos that he completely goes to bat and bends over backwards to try and convince the front office to keep Brock Olivo, I think that's the only way Brock Olivo is going to remain in Denver. Special teams has cost this team significantly all year long, and there's just been it's one of those things where it's just been consistent. Like, the offense has turned it around, the defense has turned it around, special teams continues in small ways, albeit lately, but they're just Brock Olivo doesn't seem to have any control over what's happening with his unit on the field. And then here's one last one. Now, he's not a coordinator, but he's the coach of the offensive line, Jeff Davidson, who came to the Broncos, highly touted. He's very much married, to the hip, basically, with Mike McCoy with their past and the way they've worked with each other in years past. But he comes to the Broncos. It looked good to start, kind of like last year. The first couple of games, it looked like this offensive line was going to be a force to be reckoned with, but then it really went downhill. However, Will, things have looked up ever since Ron Leary went down, and I don't say that's because of Ron Leary. He was playing at a Pro Bowl level, but something about this combination, at least having McGovern at right guard and Donald Stevenson, who had a bad game against the Colts, but the previous 2 games played very, very well. He seems to have really stabilized the unit. Is there any reason to get rid of him in 2018?
I don't think so. Because I didn't even realize that Donald Steven was starting those games against the Colts and the Jets. So I think that's a big credit to Jeff Davidson when you can just hide the worst part of your offensive line. So I think that, combined with the way Garrett Bowles has played, which, aside from penalties, I think he's been a really quality left tackle this year. Gotten a lot out of Connor McGovern, obviously. Matt Paradis has been pretty good. And then Ronald Leary, when he's been playing, has been excellent, I thought. Obviously, there's some weak parts on the offensive line, like Garcia and Watson. Basically, whoever's been playing right tackle, Alan Barber occasionally. But another thing you have to keep in mind is they shifted from a zone blocking scheme to kind of a more, it's a little bit hybrid, but it's mostly a power blocking scheme. Yeah. And that takes a little bit of time because you have to get the guys that fit the scheme. And so I think generally, I don't know if the stats back this up, but my perception has been that the offensive line has been better this year than it was in 2016. And given another year under the scheme, and we know how important continuity is to offensive line play. Yep. You get the right guys in, you get them to mesh a little bit, you get a consistent unit. I think it'll really, really start to show. And I think given the players that he had, a rookie left tackle, basically a traffic cone at right tackle, Max Garcia at left guard, I think Jeff Davidson's done a really good job with the offensive line, and so I think you keep him around.
The biggest argument for keeping him around is, you hit the nail on the head, continuity. They have to establish some continuity. They got to be able to sustain that unit and have a consistent message, consistent points of emphasis in terms of coaching and technique. So I think so long as Joseph survives, Davidson's a guy who's going to survive right along with him. Now, we're almost out of time. We'll take a couple questions here from the Mile High Mailbag. We are your Broncos priests. We're here to offer absolution and answers to your burning Broncos questions. And we'll kind of hit these rapid fire because we are running out of time. First question comes from Mile High Maniac on Twitter. Serious question. If you could only keep one Broncos QB for next year, who would it be, including whoever's on injured reserve and or the practice squad? Will, your answer.
That
only keep one.
Yeah, that second part's kind of interesting just because it doesn't rule out, or it doesn't, I should say, rule out Chad Kelly. So that's a tough one because the part about Kelly not playing and getting that redshirt year kind of makes you think that Yeah, so I think it's intriguing that it said whoever's on injured reserve and practice squad too, because that includes Chad Kelly. So we don't really know what we have in him. He might be, that guy who we were talking about as a possible day 1, day 2 quarterback in the 2017 draft. Obviously, he was Mr. Irrelevant, but that's more to his. I think that's more given his reputation as Swag Kelly or Machine Gun Kelly. Yeah. So. It's hard to say, get rid of a guy who just has intrigue, because I think we're just drawn to the mysterious and what we don't know, and our sense of curiosity overrides our sense of stability.
Plus
in some cases. Right. And we saw what he could do in his best moments at Ole Miss, and I think it was pretty impressive. I know a lot of people don't agree with me, but I think Chad Kelly was a pretty worthy quarterback in college. But I think, to be practical, you would say you need a solid backup, and I think the most solid backup on this team right now is probably Brock Osweiler.
I would agree. It's a really tough question. Good question, Mile High Maniac.
Yeah.
The football fan in me would want to say Chad Kelly, because he does have, in my opinion, there's people that disagree with this, but I think he does have a phenomenal upside. I think he's proven this year as a pro, his first year in this league, that he can keep himself out of trouble, that he can be a guy that's, seen, not heard from, so to speak. And that's earned him some props in my mind, and actually even bolstered the opinion that he could be something in the NFL. But coming off a season of such just devastation, the Broncos need the surest thing they can get at quarterback next year. So if I could only keep one, and I'm making the decisions, I'm keeping Brock Osweiler. Now, the next question, then we'll get out of here, comes from Jacob Smith on Twitter at JSMileHigh9798. Jacob's question: who's the odd man out at wide receiver next season if Latimer is locked up? Sunshine he says, definitely deserves a spot. DT is the 1, Sanders the 2, if not traded. Carlos Henderson should be in the mix. McKenzie has been mediocre at best. Fowler has some bright spots. So who's out? Will, I'll let you answer this one first as well.
Man, well, we'll just do process of elimination.
Now, remember, this is if Latimer is locked up.
Right. So, so provided that he is locked up, and I think he will be. DT, I don't think there's any question that he remains the number 1. I think he's had a really good season given the circumstances, especially lately since they made the move to Osweiler. Carlos Henderson, obviously you don't spend a third rounder on a wide receiver and then give him a redshirt year, not to give him a chance in year 2. So we'll see what he does as a receiver. Isaiah McKenzie, I'm still intrigued by what he can provide as kind of that, maybe not a slot receiver, but kind of that just almost like a scat back sort of gadget guy, I think is the right word for it. Benny Fowler, I think, is just really up and down, but I think at his best moments he can have a really big impact, kind of like he did early in the season. I think the guy, Sunshine, has been the Jim Leonard Jr. basically returning punts, which has really helped the team, I think, in the last 2 games to have anyone not named Isaiah McKenzie back there. But you kind of need that sure-handed, goofy-looking white guy to catch punts occasionally. So it really hurts me to say this, but I think it makes a little bit of sense to move on from Emmanuel Sanders, both kind of in a sense of roster building and giving other guys a chance to get snaps. And I just don't see Emmanuel Sanders as a guy who kind of wants to stick around for a rebuild. Maybe I'm wrong about that, and maybe that's just me like playing into the DMAC narrative of Emmanuel Sanders, because I think he's a great player. And I wouldn't blame him for wanting him to move on, just because, that's kind of the nature of the NFL and the free agency era, that, he wasn't a Bronco to begin with. He was drafted by the Steelers and played his first 4 years in Pittsburgh, came to Denver and, was more than anybody could have ever imagined. And
he basically goes from one Hall of Fame quarterback to another.
Right. And I don't know. It kind of hurts me to see him toil in obscurity here in Denver while they figure out the quarterback position, because he's not a lifelong Bronco, I think, like DT is. And he is a Super Bowl hero, though. He was easily the best receiver in that game, so I think he'll always have a really important spot in this franchise's history. But I think it does make sense, taking all emotions out of it, to move on from Emmanuel Sanders.
Well, and here's the key, too. Of all the guys that have value in that group, the one that has the most that you could actually get on the trading block is Emmanuel Sanders, and his contract's not that prohibitive. So there are teams out there who feel like they're one difference-making receiver away from exploding offensively, I think, who would be willing to give up a little something and take on that contract. But I'll just take a little bit of a different tact and assume they keep Sanders, which basically comes down to Sunshine, Carlos Henderson, Isaiah McKenzie, and Benny Fowler. And if I had to choose between those four guys, Benny Fowler would be the odd man out. And it's not that I think Benny Fowler sucks. I just think he's the type of receiver in this league, the type of kind of big-bodied possession guy who's a dime a dozen. You can find a million guys like him, and maybe you could argue the same for Jordan Taylor. But Jordan Taylor offers more. He's just as valuable as a receiver, if not more so, in terms of his big play ability. And as a special teamer, he can gun, and he can also return punts. And I know the team, not just the coaches, but the team love Jordan Sunshine Taylor because of what he can do and his commitment and willingness just to do whatever this team asks for. The Broncos aren't anywhere close to being willing or ready to move on from Isaiah McKenzie and Carlos Henderson. It's not even a question. So for me, it would be Benny Fowler, and that's going to do it for today. You can find Will in the Twitterverse at WillKeys6, myself at Chad N. Jensen. Make sure you're following the show also, Huddle Up Pod. Tweet us your questions. We're going to always try to address them on the show as often as we can. Look for Nick and Carl's preview of the Redskins game, all their analysis on Kirk Cousins, probably by Wednesday afternoon sometime. Also, they'll have another draft episode later this week, so make sure you subscribe. And y'all, for Will, I'm Chad. We'll talk to you soon.
Mile High Huddle